Welcome to Writing the Wrong Way. This is a podcast for serious writers who want to develop their skills in artistry and stand out in a crowded industry by taking intelligent, creative risks. I'm your host, Jonathan Ball. I hold a PhD in literature. I'm the author of numerous books, and I take a very analytical approach to art making, emphasizing both efficiency and experimentation. I'm sitting here with three other writers at Dalnavert House, this supposedly haunted house in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which belonged to the MacDonald family. So I guess it was the son of John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, who I believe was also the premier of Manitoba at one point. So this is like a restored Victorian mansion that, local legend says has haunted, and we are here because the Writers' Festival has invited us to, on I guess the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley and her friends' fateful night when they came up with, of course, they came up with some great stuff, but Shelley herself came up with the novel Frankenstein, the first work of science fiction in the modern sense, and also I always make fun of, kind of loser guys who are really protectionist about women in science fiction, like the women invented science. This woman invented science fiction as a teenager. But of course, the seminal work of horror fiction, and we've got this creepy, old house we're supposedly going to be coming up with now the future. Well, someone here has to invent a new genre, and create some classic works that will last 200 more years. So we're supposed to be locked in this haunted house all night for inspiration and terror. I'm going to have my three guests introduce themselves so you can connect your voices to their names. So we just say something. Maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. My name's Kevin Fournier, and it's good to be here.
Yeah, my name's Joanna Graham, and I'm very much looking forward to a night of writing in a haunted house. I don't think that opportunity comes around very often.
Yeah, for sure. I'm Lauren Carter. Ditto to what everybody said. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and I don't know, we're not necessarily all horror authors, but I think there is like a connection in the sense of, we've all applied to be in this haunted house, and generally speaking have like an interest in some darker material, even if you're not doing that all the time. One, do you even see yourself as having a particular interest in darker material? But two, like maybe what draws you to that material? I like to joke that I consider myself a horror writer, even though nobody agrees with me. And so to me, it's a bit more of a kind of a natural maybe outcome of my interests and my, like somewhat nihilistic philosophy. But let's start with Joanna maybe, because you were talking earlier about how you, like anyone can jump in any time here, of course, but you were talking earlier about how you don't necessarily maybe see yourself as a horror writer, but people kind of disturbed by the things you're writing.
Well, it depends on the person. So my partner, who is a big horror movie buff, would not be as disturbed by the stuff that I write as maybe some of my other relatives who don't usually read or watch kind of more sinister genres. So I don't often think of myself as a horror writer. And in fact, I always get stumped when people ask me, what kind of, like, what's your genre? And I never know fully how to answer. But I am definitely drawn to some darker themes. I went through a sort of surgery phase where I was very interested in the history of surgery and how people interact with the body and can restructure it and what happens when you cross that barrier of the skin. And some of the darker things that I'm drawn to, I think, just tie into some of the themes that I'm interested in writing about. So like grief often appears in some of my work, and that of course connects with the whole realm of things around death and things coming back from the dead and decay and all that jazz.
But you are, what's resting underneath my microphone here is an anthology that you and I were both in, called The Shadow of Reportage in Maine, which is an anthology of horror stories. And your story in that is Tapestries, if I remember right, is the title, which is, do you want to just maybe tell everyone what Tapestries is about?
Sure. Tapestries is about a girl who has recently lost her sister and is sort of stuck in. I mean, she's alive, but since the death of her sister, she's been more drawn to death and thoughts of decay, and her life has sort of become a bit of limbo. So when she is in the working at the store, she goes deeper and deeper into the florist's basement, which is unusually expansive, and she encounters this figure named Hadrian, who has been living for goodness knows how long in the depths of this building, and the depths of this building also connect to various tunnels that go deeper and deeper, and he's been down there creating, I guess you might call it an art installation, with bones and dead things that he's sort of built into this wall, along with plants and everything that are growing around them and through them, and impossibly in the underground, but somehow they're growing, and the narrator gets drawn into that world.
Yes, these tapestries, as the tale goes, of corpses, and almost like a graves and cross section is almost the sort of the image. Like, do you not consider that to be a horror story? I'm just curious how you write something like that, and don't necessarily see yourself as a horror writer.
When you put it like that, and when I hear somebody else describing it, I'm like, yeah, that does sound like a horror story. But when I was writing it, I wasn't thinking of genre at all, and I think I just got so wrapped up in the writing process, the revising process, and thinking about it, that I was just like, none of it's scary anymore. And I always sort of think of having, and this is probably an incorrect definition or a very old definition, but I think when you read horror, there's an expectation that you're going to be frightened, and I don't think that my work is scary. But
sure.
Well, I always find that when you set out to write a story, you're not really thinking of anything at all. And then when you're done, you try to sell it. And if you can sell it to a horror anthology, you do, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that you set out to write horror.
What about you? I was saying earlier to you, like, you have one of the best titles for any work that I've ever seen, which is this great book title called The Green-Eyed Queen of Suicide City. And I haven't, unfortunately, read that book, but it's an amazing title, and I it sounds immediately like it would have some pretty dark material. From what I understand, you've got all sorts of strange, speculative, dead, corpse-like god things. I don't know.
Yeah, half of the book, it alternates between the living and the dead, chapter by chapter, and so half the book is set in an afterlife specifically for people who have committed suicide. And in the book, all of them are still, if you slit your throat, you're just bleeding permanently in the afterlife, sort of thing, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of graphic gore. But, and again, when you describe it like that, it does kind of sound like a horror book. And then it descends into cannibalism at the end. But
it's not horror.
No, it's a young adult novel.
Exactly. It is a YA novel.
Right. But I started thinking about, well, I remember, so someone I knew had commented about how often in books they make death sound glamorous because the hero sacrifices them at the end, right? And so then I started thinking, well, what's a really great way you could make death not sound glamorous at all? And then the train of thought sort of followed.
Sure. What about you, Lauren? Your work doesn't as immediately sound dark, but the stuff you were reading, we had a reading earlier, has some pretty dark material in there.
Yeah, and Swarm, my first novel, is pretty dark. It's kind of post-apocalyptic after economic collapse, but very ground in realism, like an idea of what would that realistically look like. So the idea of desperation, hunger, shortage of medication, having to kind of stay in relationships you don't want to stay in because that's how you survive. I really like the idea of sort of the horror in the everyday. So I think I would describe myself more, when I do go into those areas, it's more, I think, gothic.
Sure. Like,
I love the idea of the gothic, right? The horror that is hidden beneath the middle class household, that sort of thing. That's what really attracts me and what I'm really interested in. I'm a huge fan of Joyce Carol Oates, and so much of her work is ground in that kind of dark horror of male-female relationships and how we kind of operate on a day-to-day basis in society.
I don't think a lot of horror things that get called horror are actually, like, I have a very specific theory about horror and what is and isn't horror.
I would what you talked about at the reading about the idea of monsters being the what did you say?
I think horror has to have a monster, and I think that the monsters have to have three qualities. Like, I get very specific. Like, monsters have to be abnormal, they have to be transgressive, and they have to symbolize a fate worse than death. I think that horror has to is about reality and competing ideas of what is real thematically on some level. I think there's two basic plot structures in horror. Like, I'm very I'm very structuralist about it in this way. Like I think that you have two plot structures in horror, more or less fundamentally. One is just you have this ordered world the monster comes into the world from outside, and the monster represents a force for chaos and disorder, and its presence threatens to tear reality apart, and so it has to be gotten rid of, and the whole plot action is about trying to get rid of the monster. And in a conservative horror story, or what I would call a reactionary horror story, you can get rid of the monster. This is very much what, again, monsters is a threat to order. We must value and preserve our order, and so on and so forth. You can fight the monster, and you get various things happening in a horror story. Generally speaking, I think because this is the basic structure, that trope in a slasher film, for example, where people just refuse to believe the monster exists until like halfway through the film, more or less, and they keep dying. I think there's like a fundamental structural issue in horror where, again, because the monster represents this reality that you can't believe in, characters make what we would see from the outside as stupid decisions. Like, we know, the audience, that there's vampires out, yet we see all these people, they're finding like corpses drained of blood with like holes in their necks, but they're like, no, what is causing this?
Yeah.
And like in a bad horror story, I think like the explanation for that in some ways is a structural explanation. And I think a more radical horror story, I think that's kind of where what I call reactionary horror stops. I think the radical horror story, which is what more interesting to me, goes this extra weird step where it turns out, although the monster appears to have come from outside, it actually was always already here in some form. It turns out that although it appeared like there was an ordered world and this monster was threatening it by its presence or its activity, you actually have a situation where there was no order. The order was an illusion. The monster represents the truth. If it is the truth, symbolically, it cannot be killed or stopped. It can only maybe be temporarily stayed. It's fundamentally, thematically, there's the nightmare universe of chaos that everyone has to now accept, but it's better to die than to accept it. Like, I've got all these weird theories, about horror. So I think very few things actually are horror, but I think a lot of stories have horror elements. And so I'm interested in both of those things, but I think that's, to me, that's a lot of the confusion around what is and isn't horror, or when people, you have a story with all these horror elements, and thematically it may be doing a lot of the same things that a horror story is doing, but I wouldn't necessarily qualify as horror. It's still interesting to me. But
yeah, and I think, we always try to, like, marketing, so much about marketing is about what arena is your book in, what genre is your book, right? Like, when Swarm was in the works, I remember my agent asking me, is this what you do? Do you write like speculative fiction? I was like, no.
Well, because Atwood had come
because
out with,
that would be that would be where I would be. Like, I would have to keep writing these, and my new novel is set in 1994. Like,
sure.
The Swarm was in the near future, which who knows when that's going to happen in an alternate reality. Maybe it's unfolding, but
we're not in the alternate reality.
Peak oil and stuff. Every day it feels like we are in an alternate reality, doesn't it?
From the standpoint of water.
Well, news.
Every time, from the standpoint of reality,
Yes.
we're in one.
Yeah. But that's super interesting. Like, what do you guys think about that idea of the monster?
I mean, I don't know. I may be wrong about all those ideas, but I just have a very specific,
really interesting
set of ideas about it. Because I think of like, what's the difference between a vampire and Twilight and vampire and Dracula? You know, structurally, I think there's one difference, which is that Dracula represents a fate worse than death, which is what, for the Victorian reader, a male reader, what if an immigrant could come here and we wouldn't know they were an immigrant? Because Dracula is, and explains like things in the novel that otherwise don't make sense, like why does Dracula want to learn the train schedules, you know, so that nobody will ask him, that he doesn't have to ask people for the train schedule? Why does Dracula want to speak without an accent? So that's his most important concern. You know, why does he only get upset when his money starts to spill on the ground? Because that's the real source of Dracula's power in that novel is he has money. And like all the weaknesses of being a vampire, he just buys his way through them. Like he can't cross running water, he pays guys to take him across running water. You know, he has to sleep in this dirt from Transylvania. You know, well, he pays people to like put it in a house, and you know, like, and it's a really fascinating book in a bunch of strange ways.
I read Dracula in Argentina. I was in this little town traveling on my own, and it was the only English book I could find. So I read it in this little hotel. It was awesome. It was the best. Anyway, I am.
You were saying, what do you think about monsters? Do you think about monsters? Like you were talking about, you know, you just kind of may pursue what you're doing, and then you figure out later who maybe would be interested in it.
Right.
But as you were like just find yourself drawn
Like
to certain
Hadrian,
themes.
Yeah, I wrote that a long time ago, so I'm not exactly. Hadrian came from that story went through various evolutions through over a couple of years, and I remember Hadrian I originally thought of as a different version of Hades, and then eventually he moved from that to just a representation of death and decay. But I'm writing this story now, which you reminded me of when you were talking about how the monster's always been there, and people just kind of don't acknowledge it. And it's not, maybe, it is a monster. It's a ghost and a monster. And it's something that the protagonist sees and is extremely startled and disturbed by, and she tells her husband, and he listens and he says, yes, that is alarming, but it's just a spook, and spooks happen from time to time. You just have to ignore them, and eventually they'll resolve their issues and go away. And it turns out it's like this sort of unspoken taboo that a lot of people in her community know about, and they're just all convinced that it's like eventually they'll sort themselves out and go away. We just don't talk about them. And we just don't get involved because we don't know their world, and it's dangerous. And of course then the protagonist gets involved, and I'm still working on the story, so I don't know exactly how it unfolds, but
it's a great idea. What I find interesting about that basic premise, which again I think this is the more radical strain of horror, is that you have this basic setup or construct where what's worse than dying, and I think this is specific to the horror genre. I think there's a fate that is worse than death, and what's worse than death often in a horror story is, or one of the best things that can happen in a horror story often is to die, because all your ideas about the universe are intact. But if you don't die, you have to accept the reality of this monster and all the things that it represents, which and often carries, well, instead of doing that, they'll just deny it until they're victimized, or they'll go, quote unquote mad, this sort of whatever that means. And horror has this concept of madness that it keeps thrusting upon characters, which has really nothing to do with mental illness in the real world, but like is this sort of particular idea, I think, specific to horror, that there's some reality concept that you would rather, this is your only defense, is to like lose your whole grip on reality rather than accept the monster's reality. I think the third option, which is the most interesting to me, which you rarely see, is where people embrace the reality, like embrace the monster and become a monster willingly, which you almost never see. But I find that like that's the most fascinating solution to horror to me, is the protagonist who becomes the monster and no longer is horrified by that competing idea of reality, which to me that's like the darkest possible scenario. But all those scenarios are kind of interesting to me, like in a weird way. But I like that idea of like, people are just like, oh, the spooks will move on somehow. We don't know what they're doing, but they do their thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting apartheid in a weird way. Spiritual apartheid of some sort.
Yeah. So we'll see where it ends up going.
Kevin, you had mentioned this idea that I think is really interesting. Maybe it was worth talking a little bit about, is this idea that, well, you just kind of are doing things, as a writer almost, and you kind of like later on will figure out, like where you might position it in marketing. Right. Horror for a while in the 90s.
Or even what you're doing.
Or even what you're doing.
Yeah, very much
yes,
so.
like 2 years later.
Horror, as a marketing term, it really kind of rises in certain ways with Stephen King in the 80s, the 70s and 80s. Like it's around before, but it doesn't really have like its own section of the bookstore till that point, kind of, And then in the 90s, it's like nobody can publish a horror. It's just like dead, like marketing wise. So everyone's coming with these other terms like gothic or dark fantasy or whatever. Now you can kind of say horror again, but because Get Out is.
Well, I think gothic is really different because people
different.
describe Alice Munro as being like Southern Ontario gothic, right? And there's the whole tradition of the Southern U.S. gothic.
Like
These very ordinary circumstances and stories that have this kind of creepiness to them, embedded in kind of an everydayness.
Yeah. When you were talking about that earlier, I was thinking I read The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood earlier.
Yeah.
And that seems to have a similar Southern Ontario kind of gothic to it, particularly when the two young sisters are sort of trying to figure out what's going on with their mother's miscarriages. There's some really visceral and bizarre and bloody descriptions that's just sort of like swept away and covered up in this domestic woman's realm that I found really, really interesting.
Kevin, when you were writing the Green-Eyed Queen of Suicide City, and you've got all those like really graphic ideas. Now this is being marketed as a YA novel,
right?
And so on. I'm just curious to know like how did you think of it as a YA novel as an example? Like when you're writing that, like what were your ideas about? Because at a certain point you're of course thinking, okay, I'll send it to this publisher and this and that, and
I guess because the protagonists are that age, therefore it's easy to sell it as that book.
Did you get resistance about like images like that?
I didn't. I didn't, surprisingly. My first book was also a YA novel, and they made me change the title to that one because the original title was Owen's Wet Ass. Apparently that was too sketchy. But cannibalism and the headless man and stuff like that's all fine.
And suicide in the title, I'm shocked that they allowed you to have suicide in the title.
No, I did not get any pushback at all from the publisher.
Something else. Oh, that's interesting. I'm always interested in those particular sort of that difference between kind of how you work and maybe what you're doing after, in a sense. And I'm always interested in like process. It's maybe worth asking, just kind of while we're sitting here talking about horror stories in a haunted house. What do you think of ghosts? Do you believe in ghosts? Like, I presume nobody here believes in ghosts because you're willing to be in a haunted house. But I'm curious. It's a good question. People horror authors will ask you.
I think like life is hard enough. If you can survive like life, then ghosts.
You can survive anything.
Yeah.
You could be a ghost for that reason.
Yeah, maybe.
I think of ghosts more in terms of sort of memories, and just really strong senses of kind of memories that can suddenly be evoked. And
grief.
Yeah.
Grief at 2 a.m.
Atmosphere.
Yeah, grief at 2 a.m. That's
why not do it in a haunted house?
Right.
Yeah.
I'm completely agnostic on the possibility of ghosts.
Yeah. I'm totally, agnostic / atheist about everything, more or less. So I've like no belief in ghosts whatsoever. But I find that fascinating. There's a great story Stephen King tells, which is I forget where I heard it, but when The Shining, speaking of haunted places, when The Shining was being made into a movie by Kubrick, apparently Kubrick called King up, from the UK or something, and King was like shaving in the morning, the phone rings. His wife hands him the phone and says, "Oh, it's Stanley Kubrick." He's thrilled and shocked, and he answers the phone. And Kubrick apparently starts the conversation saying, "I think," without saying hello, but just saying, "I think ghost stories are fundamentally optimistic, don't you?" Which King, I guess, replies, "Well, no." What about hell? Going to hell, or why would you say that? I guess, and he's like, "Well, a ghost story implies the existence of heaven, which I think is fundamentally optimistic." And King goes, "Well, what about hell?" And Kubrick goes, "Well, I don't believe in hell." And King goes, "Well, what if you go to heaven when you die, but the process of dying is so traumatic that it effectively breaks your mind, and you arrive in heaven, absolutely broken, traumatized, thinking it hell, and forever, this traumatic process has destroyed you eternally." And Kubrick says, "It's been nice talking to you," and hangs up and never apparently talked to King again. So I don't know how accurate that retelling is, but I always think of that as like the afterlife is having these weird complexities, perhaps.
Yeah.
If there's an afterlife, it's probably more disturbing than maybe we imagine.
I also think that it's a great setup for the movie of this night, for us to all be sitting around with, recording a podcast about how we don't believe in ghosts. It's like it's the
That's
perfect.
what Andrew Piper said to me on Twitter. He's like, the first thing you should do is was mock the ghosts openly.
Did he?
Then you'll be he's like, then you'll be sure to get
that's
some
hilarious
activity.
Good, great.
Well, one of the things we're supposed to do here primarily is come up with stories, right? I'm really curious about this particular thing. So how are you going to come up with a story? What is your actual process, to come up with a story? Like, are you coming in here with ideas that you want to flesh out and write, or are you kind of or if you're looking around, and if so, or if you have no ideas coming in, how are you go from looking around this house to coming up with an idea, I guess? I'm very curious to know what's the idea development, your story development process. Is everyone coming in with pure no idea, going to come up with something right here on the spot? That's your plan?
More or less.
Yeah.
I have a few different ideas about things that are intriguing about the Victorian time. So I think just kind of starting with those and then just writing, see what happens.
So what is intriguing to you at Victorian time?
Well, some of the creepier things, like the hair ornaments and wreaths, and the arsenic and the green paint, just stuff like that. I don't know what would work, what wouldn't work. I'm also really interested in fabric arts. I knit and I'm learning how to crochet, so I'm really interested in that women's experience and reality and shielding their faces from the fires and just stuff like that. I don't know where it's going to begin or what's going to happen. I was really
interested in that idea that when we were getting a tour around, our guide mentioned that women in these massive dresses would sometimes be too close to the fire, and their dress would catch fire and they wouldn't notice it for a while. But then of course they'd be eventually engulfed in flames,
combusting, and people just dealt with it oh well, Lucy died from
it's such a weird
fashion must go on.
It's a weird thing for you to think even happened. That arsenic story also, I never heard of that. The green paint and dresses and the walls would be slowly killing you or quickly killing you, I guess.
That grabbed me too, and it just sort of that idea and sort of willful self-destruction, or you're aware of this self-destruction, but what values are pushing you to continue with that activity anyway. I think that's kind of a relatable idea, but in Victorian, that kind of setting, it seems very extreme.
Values and pressures of society. External pressures,
And the aesthetics of it. It reminded me in some ways of the tapestry story, that idea that this aesthetic quality now to all this kind of, I guess, darker I always think stuff like that is interesting thematically because it's almost works like a metaphor for horror itself and why people maybe are interested in horror, which is the eternal question people ask horror writers and readers, like why do you find that stuff so interesting, you know? What about, do you have an idea coming in that you want to work on, or do you have are you looking around for ideas, or?
I have a slight idea, and then I'm also looking around for ideas. So I can kind of see my writing process as I actually brought 2 different notebooks. So I'm almost thinking I might start in one and see if that goes anywhere, and then start picking up an idea. If the thing that struck me walking around the house was thinking, a lot of the time I don't necessarily like to set my stories in a specific period starting out because I want to get the writing done and then do the research later. But thinking how easy it would be just sitting around the house or walking around the house to set something in this time, and it would just, if you're thinking about, okay, what's this character doing with their hands, or what are they looking at, what objects have significance to them, you just literally look around a room and being like, oh, okay, well, she's holding up a fire screen and also trying to block her face from her prying grandmother or something like that. So every object seems like it could be used.
So I came in with the opening few pages of a story idea to give myself a running start.
Cheater.
And then, yeah, I know. But then left it open so that it can go in any way, and hopefully I'll think of a way that's relevant to the surroundings.
So you'll
but
be a
I didn't want to leave
somewhere.
myself, didn't want to come up with absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I came in with a project to work on, but then in case I couldn't come up with anything else, and so, but as I kind of was on the bus here, I was kind of thinking about. I was texting my daughter, joking that, something. She was she told me not to get possessed, and I was just thinking I wonder I'm joking with her kind of about the house and this and that, and it just kind of made me think about. Of course, like you said, that's the setup for horror stories. If somebody doesn't believe, and again, from my point of view, this is the whole theoretical structure for horror. It's you don't believe in this thing, and then you are faced with the belief. And I was thinking, well, so I've been kind of I don't really have an idea yet, but I'm kind of running around in my head the idea of a person who goes to a haunted house for some reason, and again, has no, is just somehow transformed. Somehow I don't really have an idea yet, but I can see the cycling of it in my head, and because I was making jokes on Twitter, I'm also thinking in terms of lines almost in a poem that have no periods at the end. So that's all I've got so far is I want to maybe have just a bunch of lines.
I'm also a big believer in automatic writing, so that's one thing I want to do is sort of move around the house and just try to connect with kind of the energy in some of the different areas. That story that I read from tonight was a very kind of weird circumstance around that story. Was I wrote it about this woman whose husband dies suddenly of a heart attack, and 2 months after I wrote it, my stepfather dropped out of a sudden heart attack. And there were a lot of parallels in that story between my own trip to Lilydale with my mother, who was called out as a widow at Lilydale, but she was not a widow. And so it was all kind of weirdly psychic. So I like that idea. That's something that I want to do tonight, is just kind of wander around and see what happens. What's my pen going to do? And something might come of it, nothing might come of it, and of course after that you always need to figure out what is in that story, where's it going, because I'm not a big fan of stories that don't do anything, right? I like to have some kind of an arc. So, but yeah, that's one thing that I'm gonna do.
I'm very skeptical of all the ideas attached to automatic writing, but I find automatic writing as a process really interesting. So I'm kind of weirdly thinking of a similar thing. I feel like I'm just going to float around and just write lines,
Right.
See but with I'm thinking maybe the idea that this person has gone into the house and something has happened, and now they're writing lines. I don't know, but somehow like maybe it's like a thing is writing through them. Like I don't know what I'm got yet, but something along these lines is what I'm kind of. And if I don't, get anything, I'll just work on my novel.
Yeah. That's what I thought. Like, and even this place as a former rooming house too.
Yeah.
Like, I find it really interesting to think about all the people who were here, like not just the historical reality that's sort of been set up, but also when it was completely refragmented into this whole other place where who knows who is living here, and in the cook's bedroom, or I find that like the whole a structure, right, that's contained so many different lives and experiences.
Well, even the effort to turn it into a museum and kind of recreate the past has a certain necrophilia quality to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Necrophilia quality to it. Yeah, it just, I never thought about it that way, but it's very much that idea of, like loving this, like the kind of weird nostalgic aspects that, of course, could be seen in a darker light, or as some sort of weird fetishization of like a past. Yeah. There's all sorts of good reasons to have a museum, but there's there's like these.
But if you're writing a ghost story, then.
Yeah. What I find interesting and is like the thing is like when people are talking about noticing different things and like they're attracted to this idea or that idea. I think a lot of like what writing is, in terms of a process, is just find yourself attracted to certain ideas. And you kind of are noticing things. So what was always interesting to me is like if you walk around a room, like we're being toured around and told things, but there's like certain things I can see myself like catching on or I find interesting, and I'm always interested in like what do people catch on, and maybe why, and even just like what do you do when you start noticing yourself noticing things. And maybe like where do you take the idea, or how do you develop the idea? Because I think a lot of what writing is, this isn't my idea, this is something that I remember at least Neil Gaiman saying this in some interview, is that a lot of what writers do or artists do is just, a person will have an idea and then they'll just move on with life. But a writer will have an idea and notice they've had an idea, and then just start obsessively like returning to the idea, and doing something with it, say. So I'm always curious in it, and I know a lot of people who have notebooks and so on. So I'm curious, like, just know maybe a bit about people's process in terms of what do you do when you notice you're noticing a thing, and like, is there like, do you have any sort of process for capturing that, what you're noticing, or like of all the things you notice, like what maybe draws you to one more than the other, and how do you kind of move from like these vague notions into, say, like an actual work of some sort? I don't know. It's kind of an abstract question, but you know what I'm talking about. Like,
Yeah.
You notice something, you kind of like catch yourself thinking, okay, maybe I can use that.
Yes.
Like, I guess what the question is, like, how do you know whether you can use a thing?
I usually start.
It's a good question.
It is a very good question. I usually start just, and I don't mean to sound pedantic or obvious, but I usually start just writing about it and trying to write around it, and like it usually starts with a basic description, and sometimes that's all it gets to, and it's like, okay, that actually wasn't much of an idea, I just thought it looked cool. But then sometimes it leads to a character, or it leads to a conflict, or it leads to an atmosphere, which I sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully try and develop, and it just kind of grows from there.
So just actually test it out to see, is there an idea here or something I can do something with? When you're talking about the fire screens, was really interesting to me, because you're talking about like, okay, if a person was sitting there, how would they hold the fire screen and so on. It made me think of when I do screenwriting, I'll sometimes like stand in different positions, and because I'm thinking like, well, how would this person actually visually be in a room with another person, say. So you're like actually kind of maybe rehearsing. You may not have an idea at that point, but you're thinking, okay, if a person sitting there would have a thing here, and another person would be over here, and so you just will like maybe test out a description or something, just to kind of see if you can develop off of it. Yeah,
and sometimes it will actually go into a completely different direction, and it'll be like, oh, well, actually, these two characters that end up having nothing to do with this object are having an interesting fight around the object, so let's explore that tension. So.
That's really interesting. So you're basically concretizing your abstract noticing.
Guess so, yeah.
That's interesting.
So yeah, so when I have an idea pop into my head for a story or a character or whatever, or, whatever small thing, I'll play around with it in my head for just a little bit, but kind of deliberately not do it too much, and then put it aside. And I've sort of got this semi-superstitious feeling that if it was a crappy idea, I'll just forget about it. But if it was really a good idea, it'll come back to me at some point.
I do that too. I mean, I have exceptions where I'll start, noodling it down.
Yeah.
But often I'll just kind of like, yeah, maybe if I still remember it tomorrow or later, then I'll know it's
Worth pursuing, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also trying to catch up with all these things that aren't done.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am too. Like, I feel like it's been a long time since I've written something new, actually, because I have, I've been doing copy edits and stuff, and for these 2 books I have coming out next year.
Oh, you got 2 coming out next year?
Yeah.
In the same year?
Yeah.
Let me ask you, can I just segue before you get into what you're going to say?
Yeah.
Can I ask you how you convinced publishers to put 2 books out in 1 year? Because I'm having an issue. It's not really an issue, but I'm looking at my contracts and like there's all these ways in which they don't want books coming out within this much or this much from one another.
Well, one's a collection of poetry and one's a novel.
Oh, that's the reason.
Yeah. So they're
different
publishers, different. Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So yeah, I've been working on that, and I've been working on this novel, which I've been thinking about a lot tonight. It's been very helpful, this conversation, because I've been feeling like it's dead. And even though I don't want it to be dead, it's sort of like I've been working on it for about 5 years, kind of moving back and forth between different projects. So I think that is an interesting question too, is to carry something along for a long time while trying to keep it new, while trying to figure out what the newness is in it, like what is the thing that isn't quite there yet, that needs to be pulled out of it, or is it dead? That's another question that I've been asking myself. But yeah,
How do you
can't
tell
remember
if it's
what the
dead?
original question was.
Because that's another question that's kind of interesting. Is like, how do you tell if something's dead?
Yeah,
Because you probably both
indeed.
had that experience where like you work on something, either you finish it or don't finish it or whatever.
But this
at a
is
certain point it's dead.
Yeah,
To you.
it's sort of not. It's less about not just I mean, I have a lot of stuff that I've just like it's not catching my interest. I'm just gonna put it aside. I'm not really into it. But this thing I've been committed to, so it's almost like it feels more like a death, right? Because I don't want it to die, but it feels like it's
Just feels inert.
inert. But I also have a suspicion that it's inert because I haven't found the core yet, right? So it might be something that I carry along for a long time, and that you hear these stories about so and so was working on a novel for 10 years, and I kind of get that because I think
They're not really working on it like that.
well, you are though, right?
But are you?
Well,
I mean, you
I
specifically.
mean, you
like,
are in the sense of the deep subconscious.
Sure.
You are in the sense of the thing is growing along with you.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
so if you're still committed to it, right, in like 5 years from now, maybe I'll go, oh right, that's what that whole framework of a story is about. That's the deep thematic stuff.
How do you tell when like an idea? Again, like if you're doing all these tests or something's just in your mind, you're kind of returning to it. I'm always curious to know like how people determine what ideas are for them, if that makes sense. Because you always have more than one idea.
Yeah, your oeuvre.
Yeah, like is it just an instinctual thing where you keep harassing this idea somehow, like until it, just like develops for you, or is it like? I'm just always very curious why people pick one thing over the other. Mm-hmm. Again, like whether you notice this or notice that, or you test the thing, you test that thing. I think sometimes it's just an abstract thing and people don't examine it. But I'm always curious about, what makes an idea interesting to you?
Yeah,
or detail,
because
like you're doing research,
Yeah. And you have to go through the doldrums too, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to stay committed through the doldrums of the thing but I think it's sort of like, for me, it's like what Kevin said, if it keeps coming back, right? Like like for me, I can tell when something's really grabbed me when I start waking up in the middle of the night and I need to get up and write, or I'm going to lose what's there. And it feels alive.
Right.
So
Yeah, similarly for me, it's like I said earlier, if I have an idea or if I think something's interesting, I will start writing around it, and a lot of it just goes absolutely nowhere. But the stuff that I do keep coming back to, the stuff that I keep thinking about, the stuff that makes me have like a pad of Post-its by my bed, so that when I have that thought right as I'm falling asleep, usually I can just scribble it down and keep going to. Those are the ones that I feel are worth developing. And I don't know if I can really say why, because that's not necessarily answering your question. It's just like, these are the ones that do it, but I'm not sure exactly what it is about that idea.
So have you noticed certain things you keep coming back to?
Well, I mentioned it a bit earlier. Some themes that I keep coming back to are grief and how people deal with things that are outside of their control.
Sure. It's very much a horror sort of theme, like especially like the Lovecraftian, or even not horror, but in Kafka, that whole idea that there's the universe is a system outside of your control somehow, and it's mysterious and disturbing.
Yeah.
Machinic in a way.
Yeah.
So one of my other tests for ideas that are worth pursuing are the ones that automatically lead to more ideas.
Sure.
Then there's a domino effect. If the idea just sits there on its own, maybe you'll get half a page out of it, but it's not really worth putting more into it than that.
Did you study here? Did you go to university here?
I did not go to university at all. No.
Okay, guys. Because I kind of work in that way, but specifically because Dennis Cooley at the University of Manitoba taught me how to work in that way. Like you just try a bunch of things, and like what he called it mining the site. Like you find some site and you like mine that site, in a manner of speaking. There's just something that catches your interest, but where you really want to dig deep, in kind of his metaphors, was when there's more stuff down there. Like you could get instead of just one poem, you've got a whole book of things about this, or he's always turning out these kind of thematically connected poem collections. And I always found that a really useful idea, that you'd have this some broad idea that you just keep delving into. Like I did a book called Clockfire, which was plays that are impossible to produce, and so it was very much that sort of process of like, okay, well, what's another thing in the theater? Well, there's lights in the theater, and so I would write a poem about lights, and how would you make that impossible to produce play? Well, you just keep adding lights till the audience is blind, and then like, what else is in the theater? Well, what could you do in a theater? What are you not supposed to do in the theater? So the title poem of Clockfire is, the audience is sitting in their seats, and the curtain comes up, and there's just a clock on stage, and everyone's just looking at this clock, wondering why. And then as they're doing this, the line is, the actors sneak behind the audience and set the theater on fire. And I found like that could have, like, I got a whole book out of that sort of thing, like just like, again, like Cooley's idea. You just like, okay, well, here's just a vague idea, and just kind of just keep, what are all the iterations, or it's kind of what Joanna was talking about in some ways, like just kind of writing around, well, where does this go, or where does that go?
For me, I like to also really connect with the emotional reality, like what's pulling me in about the character, right? Like, and where they are at emotionally. That's important for me.
You have to have a character, for a fiction, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
poetry
even
as well, even poetry.
For poetry, it's capturing emotional experience also for poetry, and usually it's mine or an imagined narrator.
The one other thing I'm just curious about, just to return this idea of an idea being dead. I'm just always curious, like when you decide to abandon a project, is it like an instinctual thing as well? Again, you just don't feel like this project works anymore, or do you ever make I'm always curious, like, why do people abandon ideas? Like, why do they pursue them? Why do they abandon them? I find I abandon ideas, even if I still think they're good ideas, if they don't feel visceral.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so yeah, if there's not some emotional quality, or even just some disturbing quality, or some other thing where it's not, like, I always get upset or leery of what I'm doing if it's kind of going according to plan. Like, I do a lot of planning in, let's say, a story, and then if I follow the plan exactly, then I'm not satisfied. I always want to kind of veer in a certain direction, or kind of just have some sort of, I'm always on the lookout for like a bloodless intellectualism, because I know that's like my tendency, so like I don't know. So to me, like, something sometimes is dead if it just somehow doesn't have like this visceral quality, whatever that means.
Surprise,
or even just a like disturbing aspect. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. But I'm always curious, like, why people pick up and drop ideas. I think it's sometimes just an instinct and you can't explain it. But
yeah, I don't think I ever consciously drop an idea. You just get more interested in a different idea.
Sure.
And the other one sort of gets forgotten about. And then often what I do is I'll end up cannibalizing old manuscripts. So I'll take ideas, and then at some point I'll realize, I've stolen too much from that book. It's it's pretty much gone now. I've carved all the good chunks out of it and used it in other stories. But it's never a conscious decision. It's always just something else caught my interest at the moment, and I put it aside for now, and then for now it ends up being forever.
Isn't that a danger, though, as well, like in the process? Like, do you ever, where you do that too much? Because sometimes I'll find myself procrastinating by starting a new thing in that sort of sense.
Yeah, I don't know.
Not always, but
I wouldn't call it a danger, because I don't know particularly what the goal is. As long as I'm writing good work and I'm enjoying the process, then that's kind of the end goal in and of itself, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's curious.
Yeah, like this novel that I am investigating whether or not it's dead. I actually wrote the draft of it before I started the one that's coming out next year.
Oh yeah.
So, I think I was pulled towards that one, and then went back and forth for a while. But I think if you're continuing to work and send stuff out and stuff, I don't think it's a danger. I think it's part of the process.
I guess as long as you're not getting, like,
you think
you're
right?
finishing nothing.
Like, if you have this habit and tendency to just constantly have squirrel brain or whatever it's called, to flip between ideas. Yeah.
Well,
so speaking of procrastinating,
we should probably get to work here. Well, thanks so much for being my guests. And do any of you have maybe can you just talk about what you're doing next, or that people listening should check out? What do you want to plug?
I'm actually doing a writing workshop at Falcon Lake Resort. Falcon Shores. Sorry, I'm fairly new to the area. So with Donna Basil, another Winnipeg writer, in November. So you can find a lot of information on. I do blog fairly regularly at laurencarter.ca, and the books that are coming out. A poetry collection called Following Sea in February, and my next novel is out next fall, and it's called This Has Nothing to Do with You.
It's a great title.
Thanks. I love it.
I don't really have anything that I would like to plug. I've got a short story I'm working on. I have a novella that I'm working on that I'm hoping to polish up and find homes for, but I'm still in the polishing phase, and so nothing quite has a home yet, so nothing to plug.
Do you have a website?
I actually do not know.
You need a website.
That's a good, I need to get on that.
And I got nothing to plug. I just finished a novel, but I have not yet found a publisher for it, and I haven't barely even started looking for one. So at some point, that will be coming out, hopefully.
Is the Green-Eyed Queen of Suicide City your last novel?
That was my last novel, yeah.
You don't have a website either.
I do not. I don't even have a phone.
Everybody needs a website. I have like 20 websites. It's like an addiction. Well, thanks so much. And if we never are seen live again, you'll know that we are here at Dalnavert House, haunting the grounds. But yeah, thanks for listening, and keep writing the wrong way.